I stood in front of my wife's old tailoring shop, a rusty key resting in my hand. Just moments earlier, my son had called telling me to leave the house I had lived in for more than 30 years, within 48 hours. A few hours before that, at the lawyer's office, I heard my name read last. Not the mansion, not the money, just this shop. Daniel laughed. Brittany held up her phone and recorded everything. And in that moment, I realized something was deeply wrong with Margaret's will. Before I tell you what happened next, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Thank you. Now, let me take you back to the moment when everything began to turn in a different direction. I still remember clearly the moment I walked out of the lawyer's office that afternoon. No one said another word to me. Daniel went first, shoulders back, walking fast, like staying one more second might scuff his new leather shoes. Brittany followed behind him, adjusting the lighting on her phone as she walked. Her voice was low, but loud enough for me to hear. Everything is finally over. I stayed behind for a few more minutes, alone. The lawyer closed the file and looked at me with that expression people save for someone who has just lost something, but hasn't yet realized how much. He asked if I needed a ride home. I shook my head. I needed to walk. I needed space to breathe. Margaret lived with me for more than 40 years. I knew her better than anyone, and because of that, I knew what had just happened was not as simple as Daniel believed. The will had been read clearly, item by item, no vague clauses, no wasted words. The lakeside mansion was transferred immediately. The investment fund changed control within 10 days. Everything was smooth, clean, perfect in the way Daniel always liked. When it came to me, the room went silent. The lawyer cleared his throat. Then he read the name of the shop. Margaret's Threads. That was it. Daniel laughed, not even trying to hide it. He turned toward me, his eyes mixed with pity and mockery. He said I was a smart man, but that I had never understood how money really works in this world. Brittany leaned in and quickly snapped a photo of me with my head lowered, probably saving it for some story later about the sacrifices of the older generation. I didn't react, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was thinking. Margaret never did anything at random. She didn't talk much, but every decision had a reason. An old tailoring shop, while the rest of the estate was divided so neatly. That balance made me uneasy. We returned to the house at the same time, and that was the last time I called that place home. Brittany stood in the living room, talking on the phone without lowering her voice. She spoke about temporarily packing up, about how the new mansion needed a completely different atmosphere. Then Daniel walked over and placed a stack of papers in front of me, a notice of property transfer. He said I had 48 hours to sort things out. I asked him where he expected me to go. He didn't answer. He just said everything had been decided legally, and that I should understand. I looked at the face of the son I once taught how to ride a bike, the boy I stayed up with all night when he had a high fever. That face now felt completely unfamiliar. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed only what I needed. Clothes, a few old notebooks, the watch Margaret gave me on our 20th anniversary. I didn't take much. I didn't know where I would end up, but I knew there was one place I had to go. The next morning I drove to the old district. The shop was there, tucked between two stores that had changed owners many times over the decades. The sign was old. The letters faded. Dust covered the glass. People passed by without looking. I parked the car and sat there for a few minutes. I had stood in front of this shop many times while Margaret was still alive, but I rarely went inside. It was her world. I respected that boundary. Now, that boundary was mine alone. The key sat in my coat pocket, heavier than I expected. I remembered Margaret placing it in my hand so calmly a few weeks before she passed. She only said, "If there ever comes a day you need it, it will open the door." I used to think she meant just this door. When I slid the key into the lock, my hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the feeling that I was stepping into a part of my life I had ignored for far too long. The door opened with a dry sound. The smell of old fabric machine oil and time itself spilled out. I stood still for a few seconds. Inside, nothing had changed since the last time I saw it. The old cutting table, neatly stacked rolls of fabric, the industrial sewing machines against the wall, everything was quiet. but not empty. As if Margaret had only stepped out for a moment. I closed the door behind me, and in that moment I understood something very clearly. If Margaret left this place to me, it was not comfort, and it certainly was not punishment. It was a reminder, and maybe a test I didn't yet know whether I was ready to face. I didn't turn on the lights right away. The dim glow from the front window was enough to make out the familiar shapes. I moved slowly, afraid of disturbing the silence Margaret had left behind. Each step echoed clearly as if the room itself was recording my presence after a long absence. I set my bag down beside the cutting table. That table had always caught my eye, even though I had never touched it before. It was too big for a small tailoring shop. Too solid. When she was alive, Margaret used to joke that it was built to hold the weight of the whole world. I never asked what she meant. Now, I was starting to wonder. I walked a slow circle around the shop. The fabric shelves were arranged carefully by color and by texture. Everything had its place. Margaret never let disorder last long. I opened a drawer and found several notebooks. Not orders, not measurements. Short notes. Written in her familiar handwriting, but the contents felt foreign. Numbers, symbols, lines carefully crossed out. I closed the drawer. The instincts of a man who once worked in engineering began to stir. There was something here that didn't belong in an ordinary tailoring shop. I returned to the cutting table. When I placed my hand on the wooden surface, I felt an unnecessary thickness. I bent down and examined the legs. The joints were reinforced in a way I had only seen in structures built to carry heavy loads. No one does that just to cut fabric. I knelt and looked closer. Under the table there was a faint outline, almost hidden beneath dust and machine oil. If I hadn't been trained to notice structural details, I would have missed it. I pressed lightly. Nothing happened. I tried again, this time applying steady pressure. The way you test an old locking mechanism. There was a sound, very soft, like something giving in, reluctantly. I froze. My heart beat slow but heavy. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I pushed gently on the wooden panel. A small section slid aside, revealing a concealed metal handle. No decoration, no markings, just a piece designed to be overlooked. I pulled the handle. The table shifted. Not much, but enough to open a narrow gap. Cold air rushed out from inside. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The beam fell onto a tight staircase leading down beneath the shop floor. Margaret had kept this secret right beneath my feet. For all those years. I stood there for a long time. Not out of fear, but because I was rearranging the image of the woman I thought I had fully understood. Finally, I stepped down. Each stair was solid with a handrail. This wasn't built in a hurry. When my foot touched the floor below, the lights turned on automatically. That made me stop again. The room underneath was small, but complete. Soundproofed, clean. The walls were covered with noteboards, diagrams, and sealed samples. No sewing machines. No ordinary fabric. Instead, thin spools of fiber, each labeled with coded markings. I moved closer to a work table. Printed documents lay spread across it. Contracts, reports, and a thick file. I opened the first page. Margaret Thompson's name stood clearly at the top, followed by terms I recognized from my working years. Research, testing, process. Margaret hadn't just been sewing here. She had been researching. I sat down and read slowly. A new type of bio-based fiber. Durable, safe, biodegradable. The test results were recorded carefully, without a trace of unnecessary emotion. I recognized this style. This wasn't the writing of a craftswoman. This was how an engineer writes. I stopped at a contract. The logo of a biotech corporation stood out. Ethel Corp. A proposal for long-term licensing rights. The figures were clear. They needed no explanation. I closed the file and let out a long breath. While Daniel believed this shop was a burden, Margaret had placed something here that he never even knew how to see. I sat in that room for a long time. There was no feeling of victory, only a heavy silence. I thought about Daniel's laughter, about Brittany recording with her phone. They had looked at this shop the same way they looked at me. Outdated, irrelevant. I turned off the lights, went back upstairs, and slid the table into its original position. Everything looked exactly as before. If someone walked in, they wouldn't notice a thing. I locked the shop, held the key in my hand, and for the first time since Margaret passed, I understood why she left this place to me. Not so I could live off it, but so I could protect what she had quietly built. And right then, I knew one thing for certain. This story was far from over. It had only just begun, in a way Daniel and Brittany were not prepared to face. I didn't tell anyone about the room beneath the tailor shop, not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because I knew Margaret well enough to understand this one thing. If she had wanted others to see it, she wouldn't have hidden it so carefully. I locked the shop and left after dark, my mind crowded with questions that had no answers yet. That night, I came back, not to investigate further, but to stay. I laid an old blanket across the long bench in the corner. It didn't feel like being thrown out of my home. It felt like a shift, as if I was finally walking a path Margaret had drawn long ago. And as always, I was one step behind her. The next morning, I began to clean, not to change the shop, but to understand it. I wiped down every fabric shelf, every tabletop. Each object sat exactly where it belonged. Margaret never left room for chance. When I opened the drawer beneath the oldest industrial sewing machine, I found a measuring tape, worn. The edges faded with time. I picked it up out of habit, and immediately noticed it was heavier than it should be. I didn't rush. I sat down, placed the tape on the table, and looked at it for a long while. Margaret used to say the most familiar things are the best places to hide secrets. Carefully, I loosened the stitching at one end. Inside wasn't a plastic core, but a tightly rolled strip of thin paper. I unfolded it. It was Margaret's handwriting. Not a few short lines. A long letter, written carefully. Each page numbered. A notarized seal on the final page. I read slowly, the way she always said important things should be read. Margaret wrote that she knew exactly how Daniel and Brittany would react. She didn't blame them, but she didn't trust their judgment when money was involved. She said she didn't want to leave her estate to greed, and she didn't want me forced to fight my own son. She explained the will. Everything had been arranged to look clear, fair, and convincing. The investment fund Daniel received was no mistake. It was a calculated choice. Margaret had studied that fund years earlier and uncovered legal issues buried beneath the surface. She knew it would collapse. Not immediately, but fast enough to test Daniel's patience and understanding. She wrote that if Daniel slowed down, if he questioned things, if he looked closer, then it could still be saved. But if he trusted his confidence more than the truth, the outcome would speak for itself. I folded the letter and set it on the table. There was no sense of satisfaction, only a deep, quiet sadness. Margaret wasn't trying to punish her son. She was simply allowing him to face his own choices. I kept reading. She wrote about me. She said she knew I wouldn't ask why, that I would walk into the tailor shop before looking for answers anywhere else. She wrote that I was the only person she trusted to stay silent long enough to understand the true value of what she left behind. On the final page, she mentioned the trust. My name was there, clearly stated. The sole beneficiary. Irrevocable, not open to dispute. All the rights from an old agreement I had signed many years earlier, back when I was still working, had been transferred into it long ago. I had stopped paying attention to it after retirement. Margaret hadn't. She wrote that the tailor shop wasn't an asset. It was an anchor, the place she believed I would still be standing when everything else was pulled away. I sat there for a long time. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass and settled across the table. The letter lay still, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Around noon, my phone vibrated. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready to speak while the story was still unfolding. A few days later, I received a notice from the bank. The numbers had begun to shift. Slowly, but unmistakably. I didn't interfere. I only watched. The way Margaret had, I returned to the room beneath the shop, this time not to discover, but to prepare. I organized the files, marked the important documents. I called an old lawyer, someone I had worked with for years. I didn't explain much. I only said I needed everything reviewed carefully, and kept quiet. When I closed the door to that room, it no longer felt like I was uncovering a secret. I was standing inside a plan that had been set in motion long ago. And at last, It was my turn to carry it forward. Margaret didn't leave me safety. She left me responsibility. And with that responsibility came the question I knew Daniel would eventually have to face when everything falls apart. Would he choose to keep blaming others, or finally understand what he had overlooked from the very beginning? I didn't need to count the days. I only had to watch the small changes appearing in the financial alerts on my phone. At first there were delays, then unusual adjustments, and finally the cold, impersonal lines announcing that part of the accounts had been frozen. Everything unfolded exactly as Margaret had written. Not sooner, not later. I continued living in the tailor shop. Every morning I opened the door at the same hour Margaret used to. I made coffee, sat by the cutting table, and reread her notes. I didn't rush to act. I let things move on their own, toward the point they were bound to reach. Exactly 4 months after the will was read, Daniel called me again. This time, I answered. His voice was no longer steady. The familiar speed was gone, the tone of someone who always believed he was several steps ahead. He spoke quickly, as if afraid that if he stopped, the silence would swallow him whole. He talked about unforeseen troubles, about partners who had gone quiet, about meetings that dragged on without clear answers. I just listened. I didn't interrupt. When he asked if there was anything I could do to help, I told him I had no authority to intervene. I reminded him that every decision had been signed and finalized legally. I said it calmly, without blame. That silence on the other end lasted a long time. A few weeks later, Brittany called. Not on video, just a regular phone call. Her voice was lower than I had ever heard it. She spoke about pressure, about having to sell things that were no longer necessary. I didn't ask questions. I already knew the lakeside mansion was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, I began to reappear. Quietly, without spectacle, I attended a sustainability charity event in the city. I didn't go as a major sponsor, just a name on the guest list. But when it came time to introduce a new partnership project, my name was announced. I walked onto the stage with a thin folder in my hand. The lights didn't unsettle me. I had stood in front of much larger rooms back when I was still working. I signed the contract with Ethel Corp, activating the agreement Margaret had prepared long ago. The first payment was announced. No explanation needed. I knew Daniel was watching. I knew Brittany was, too. Not because I saw them, but because I understood how they watched the world. Through screens. Through things they could no longer control. After that event, everything moved faster. Loans were called in. Legal notices followed. The mansion was listed for sale, then seized before a suitable buyer could be found. Daniel stopped calling. Brittany came to the tailor shop. She stood outside the door for a long time before stepping in. No recording. No adjusting the light. She looked around, as if seeing the place properly for the first time. I didn't invite her to sit. I didn't ask how she was doing. I handed her a folder, copies of the trust documents, the licensing agreement for Margaret's technology. She read it, her hands trembling slightly. I told her everything had been decided long ago, not by me, but by the choices each of us had made. I told her this shop was no longer something they could dismiss. It was where Margaret placed her final trust. Daniel arrived later. He looked older than his age. His shoulders sagged. He no longer scanned the room with a judging gaze. He looked at me for a long time, then asked why I hadn't spoken sooner. I told him I had nothing to say. I hadn't set a trap. I had simply stood still while he walked into it. I told him Margaret had given him a chance. He hadn't recognized it. There was no shouting, no raised voices, only a long silence, heavier than any confrontation. At last, Daniel asked what I wanted. I told him I didn't want his money. I wanted him to work, not for me, but for a new fund, non-profit, transparent management. I wanted him to use his knowledge to repair what he once looked down on. I told him Brittany would have to be involved as well, not as a public face, but as real labor, learning what it means to be responsible for what she promotes. They didn't answer right away. They left in silence. That evening, I locked the tailor shop and stood alone in the familiar room. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a circle slowly closing. Margaret hadn't tried to shield me from the world. She had simply placed me where I could stand firm when the world tested our family. I looked at the cutting table, the place that hid a truth far greater than its worn surface. And I understood that the real shock was never about money or the collapse of shiny things. It comes in the moment when a person is forced to look directly at themselves, with nothing left to hide behind. And I knew that for Daniel and Brittany, that moment was only just beginning. Daniel didn't come back right away. Neither did Brittany. I didn't push them. I understood that some offers, if made too early, sound like disguised charity. Margaret never taught me to do that. A few weeks passed. The tailor shop still opened every morning. I began fixing what needed attention, not to make it new, but to make it last. I kept the old sign. I kept the familiar smell of fabric. Only the room beneath the floor changed slowly, carefully, quietly. Daniel showed up one late afternoon. No appointment. He stood at the door waiting for me to look up. He looked thinner, not from lack of food, but from lack of sleep. He said he had reread all the documents I gave him, that he understood what he had overlooked. I didn't answer right away. I only asked him one thing. Was he willing to work, without a title, without final authority? He nodded. No hesitation. Brittany came a few days later. This time she didn't linger outside. She stepped in, looked around, and asked what she could do. I told her the work wouldn't look good on camera, and it wouldn't make for easy stories. She didn't argue. She just stayed quiet. The months that followed moved slowly. Daniel worked in a small room behind the shop, handling the books for the new fund. No salary, no bonuses, everything audited independently. Brittany worked with young designers. No filming, no posting. She learned how to listen. Some days she left the shop in silence, tired in a way stage lights had never made her feel. I didn't watch them closely. I observed from a distance, not to find fault, but to see whether change was real. Margaret used to say true remorse doesn't come from apologies. It comes from new habits. When the next payment from the technology agreement arrived, I didn't announce it. I let the system run exactly as it had been designed. The trust stayed where it belonged. I kept control, not because I didn't trust Daniel, but because I understood how easily people change with circumstances. One evening, Daniel stayed late. He said it was the first time he had seen money stop being the center of every decision. He said it made him uncomfortable, and lighter at the same time. I didn't respond. I just told him to turn off the lights before he left. Brittany changed more slowly, but her change was clearer. She spoke less, listened more. When a young designer failed to meet expectations, she didn't walk away. She stayed. I saw it in the way they greeted her every morning. Toward the end of that year, I made a decision I had thought about for a long time. I used part of the fund to settle the remaining debts of Daniel and Brittany, not to return them to their old lives, but to give them a stable floor to stand on. A small house. No lake, no gates, just quiet. I made it clear this wasn't a reward, and it wasn't full forgiveness. It was a chance to keep living without being crushed by past choices. Daniel understood. So did Brittany. They didn't thank me too much. That reassured me. The tailor shop took on a new name, not to replace the old one, but to expand it. The Margaret Thompson Initiative. I kept the front space as it was. The back became a shared workspace for young people. No noise, no spectacle, just a place safe enough to try and fail. On opening day, there was no big event, just a few of Margaret's old friends, a few designers. Daniel stayed in the back, handling paperwork. Brittany prepared tea. I stood alone by the cutting table, my hand resting on the familiar wood. I remembered the first day I stood here, with a rusty key, and the feeling of being left behind. Everything was still old, but I no longer felt abandoned. I was standing exactly where Margaret wanted me to stand. That evening, after everyone had gone, I went down to the room beneath the floor. The fiber spools were neatly arranged. New notes had been added, continuing Margaret's handwriting. I hung the tie she once made for me, woven from the very first bio-based fiber, on the coat hook. I stood in front of her portrait in the corner of the room. I didn't say much. I told her I had done my best, not to break what she built, that our son was still learning, and that I would stay here a little longer. When I turned off the lights and locked the shop, Old Greenville Street was quiet as always. No applause, no bright lights, just continuation, slow and steady. Margaret was right. The things people once call useless are often the things that last the longest. And sometimes fairness doesn't arrive through victory, but through everyone being placed back where they truly belong. I walked on, unhurried. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying the need to prove anything. Only a quiet steadiness, enough to know this story had closed the way it was meant to. I don't know if I did everything right. I only know that if I hadn't opened that old Tailor shop door that day, everything might have ended very differently. Money can disappear. So can reputation. But what a person leaves behind through their choices, that stays for a long time. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent the way I did? Or would you have spoken the truth sooner? If you stayed with me until the end. Thank you for listening to my story. If it made you think, or brought back a memory about your own family, leave a like so I know I didn't tell it alone. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share it if you think someone might need to hear it right now. Thank you for your time, and I wish you a peaceful evening.